The school hallways echoed with the sound of students chattering, sneakers squeaking against the polished floors, and lockers slamming shut. It was the beginning of a new semester at Blackwood High, and everything seemed normal, except for one thing. A new student had joined the school, but unlike most newcomers, he was different. He never spoke. His name was Nathaniel Gray. Nathaniel sat in the back of the classroom, always alone. He never raised his hand, never interacted with anyone, and his gaze, dark and hollow, sent chills down the spines of those who dared to look at him too long. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he had lost his voice due to a terrible accident. Others whispered that he was a ghost, trapped between life and death. Sophia Reynolds, a curious and outspoken girl, found herself strangely drawn to him. Something about his silence intrigued her. Was it shyness, trauma, or something far more sinister? One evening, after school, she saw Nathaniel standing by the old, abandoned library building at the far end of the school grounds. The place had been locked for years, ever since a student went missing inside and was never found. As she approached, the air turned cold. "Nathaniel," she called out hesitantly. He turned his head slowly toward her. His lips moved, forming silent words, words she couldn't hear. Then, suddenly, a whisper filled her ears. "Leave, before it's too late." But the words weren't coming from Nathaniel. They were coming from behind her. The walls of Blackwood High whispered secrets long forgotten, but tonight, they screamed. Sophia ran through the abandoned library, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the cracked walls, and the air smelled of mold and something metallic, something like blood. Nathaniel was behind her, his face pale, his lips still sealed in silence. He had led her here, to this cursed place, to show her the truth. She reached the center of the room, where a rotting wooden floorboard had been pried open. Below, a dark hole yawned like an open grave. And inside, she saw it, bones. A skeleton curled into itself, the remains of a boy long forgotten. Sophia covered her mouth to stifle a scream. The pieces finally fell into place. Nathaniel wasn't a new student. He had been here all along. The boy in the grave was him. Memories flooded her mind. Memories that weren't hers. A group of students, laughing cruelly. A boy being pushed, beaten, trapped beneath the floorboards, left to die in silence. And the worst part, the students who had done this had grown up. They were now the teachers of Blackwood High. A cold hand touched her shoulder. Sophia turned, and for the first time, Nathaniel spoke. "They buried me in silence. They thought no one would hear me scream." His voice was hollow, filled with sorrow and rage. The room trembled as whispers surrounded her, the voices of the past clawing their way back into the present. The walls cracked. Books tumbled from the shelves. The school was collapsing. Sophia stumbled backward, barely escaping as the library caved in. Dust and debris filled the air, and for a moment, all was silent. When she looked back, Nathaniel was gone. The next morning, the news spread. The ruins of the library had revealed human remains, bones hidden beneath the school for decades. The authorities investigated, and one by one, the guilty teachers were arrested. But even after justice was served, Sophia never forgot the last thing she heard before escaping. A whisper in her ear, cold as death itself. "Thank you for listening." And then, silence. The first time we noticed him, he was sitting in the farthest corner of the classroom, near the window. No one had seen him enter, and no one had spoken to him. He didn't introduce himself, and the teacher never acknowledged his presence. He was just there. At first, we thought he was just a quiet kid, maybe shy or new to the school. But something about him felt off. His uniform was slightly outdated, a style that wasn't used anymore. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the flickering fluorescent lights. But what disturbed us the most were his eyes. Dark, empty, and always staring. "Hey, did you see that new kid? MIA?" My best friend whispered during lunch. You mean the silent one? Yeah, he creeps me out, I replied. I don't think I've ever seen him blink, she added with a nervous chuckle. I turned to look at the farthest table in the cafeteria. He was sitting there alone, not eating, not moving, just staring at his tray. His presence sent a shiver down my spine. Then, strange things started happening. The next morning, I walked into class and noticed something strange. The desk where the silent student sat was gone. Not just empty, completely gone. Where's the desk that was here? I asked, pointing at the empty space. What desk? Our teacher, Mrs. Callahan, frowned. The one by the window. The new kid sat there yesterday. Everyone in the class turned to look at me. Some giggled, some looked confused. There was no new kid, Mrs. Callahan said firmly. I felt my stomach drop. I turned to MIA, but she only shook her head. You sat next to the window yesterday, remember? She whispered. No, that wasn't right. I knew what I saw. I knew there was someone there. And then, that night, I heard the whispering. It started as a faint rustling sound, like papers shifting on a desk. Then it grew louder. Soft murmurs, unintelligible but insistent. It came from the direction of my bedroom window. I turned over in bed, my heart pounding. Slowly, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The light hit the glass of my window, and my breath caught in my throat. There he was, the silent student. His face was pressed against the window, his empty eyes locked onto mine. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out of my mouth. I scrambled backward, reaching for my phone to call someone, anyone, but when I looked back at the window, he was gone. The next day, I didn't go to school. I couldn't. Instead, I went to the school library, searching for any records about past students. If he wasn't real, then why did I see him? I finally found something in an old newspaper archive. Tragic death of a student in 1995. A boy found dead in his classroom, seated at his desk. Cause of death unknown. Students and teachers reported seeing his figure in the school long after his passing. My breath hitched. The article included a photo. It was him. I slammed the book shut and ran out of the library. But when I reached the hallway, I froze. He was there, standing at the end of the corridor, watching me. This time, he spoke. You took my seat. And then everything went dark. I woke up in darkness. A chilling silence surrounded me, thick and suffocating. My head throbbed as I struggled to remember what had happened. The last thing I recalled was the silent student whispering, "You took my seat." I tried to move, but my body felt paralyzed. My breath came in shallow gasps as I realized I wasn't in the school hallway anymore. I was in a classroom. But not my classroom. The desks were old and covered in dust, the air stale as if no one had entered for years. The windows were cracked, the chalkboard filled with faded writing that had long since lost its meaning. And then, I saw him. He stood at the front of the room, staring at me with those hollow eyes. His mouth moved again, but this time, I could hear him. "You don't belong here." I tried to speak, to ask where I was, but my voice wouldn't come out. The classroom around me started to shift, the walls decayed, the ceiling cracked, and shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor. I could hear whispers now, a chorus of voices overlapping, echoing inside my skull. Then I saw them. More students, sitting in the desks. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, lifeless. They all turned their heads in unison to look at me. I realized in horror. I was sitting in a desk, too. I had taken his seat. I pushed against the desk, trying to stand, but it wouldn't move. My body wouldn't move. The silent student stepped closer, his hand reaching out. His fingers were ice cold as they brushed against my shoulder. "Now, you stay." The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a violent storm. My vision blurred, my breath shallow, my body frozen in place. And then, silence. The next day at school, MIA walked into class, glancing at the empty desk by the window. "Where's she?" she asked, frowning. Mrs. Callahan blinked at her. "Who? You know, my best friend." MIA trailed off, looking around. No one else seemed to react. Her stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. MIA turned toward the farthest desk, the one by the window. For a split second, she swore she saw someone sitting there. A girl in an outdated uniform. Silent, staring, and then, she was gone. Street. Helena High School was an old institution, its walls filled with the whispers of generations past. It had seen countless students walk through its halls, but none quite like the new transfer student, Elias Carter. He arrived without much fuss. No parents dropping him off, no grand introductions. Just a tall, thin boy with pale skin and deep-set, tired eyes. He was quiet, eerily so. He never spoke unless absolutely necessary, and even then, his voice was barely above a whisper. The students whispered about him. Some said he had come from a mental institution. Others claimed he was a runaway. The teachers, however, seemed unfazed, simply treating him as another face in the crowded classrooms. But Olivia, a curious and outspoken girl, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling Elias gave her. She noticed how he always sat in the darkest corner of the room, how his uniform looked strangely outdated, and how, despite never speaking, his presence was impossible to ignore. Then the strange things began happening. It started small. The lights in the hallway flickered whenever Elias walked past. Books fell from shelves without reason. A chilling draft followed him, even when the windows were shut tight. One evening, Olivia stayed late to finish a project in the library. The room was silent, save for the scratching of her pen against paper. Determined to understand what was happening, Olivia went to the school office the next morning to check Elias' student records. But there were none. No files. No enrollment papers. No proof that Elias Carter had ever been registered at St. Helena High. It was as if he had never existed. Olivia stood frozen in the dimly lit office, staring at the empty space where Elias Carter's student records should have been. The school secretary, Mrs. Hawthorne, gave her a puzzled look. "There's no Elias Carter in our system, dear. Are you sure you have the right name?" "But, he's in my class," Olivia insisted. "I've seen him. Talked to him." Mrs. Hawthorne frowned, typing something into the ancient computer. "I'm sorry, but there has never been an Elias Carter at St. Helena High." Olivia felt a chill creep up her spine. Was she losing her mind? That night, she couldn't sleep. The memory of Elias's words haunted her. "I never transferred." What did he mean? Determined to find answers, she snuck into the school library after hours. The old building was eerily silent, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. She headed straight for the archives, where records of past students were kept. Dust swirled in the air as she flipped through the brittle pages of an old yearbook. Her breath caught when she saw a faded black and white photograph of a boy sitting in the back row of a class picture. Elias Carter. Only, the date at the bottom of the page read 1963. Her heart pounded. This wasn't possible. If Elias had been a student in 1963, he would be an old man by now. But the boy in the picture was exactly the same as the one she had seen in class. A cold whisper brushed against her ear. "You weren't supposed to remember." Olivia whirled around. The library was empty, but she could feel it, the heavy, suffocating presence of something unseen. The lights flickered. A chair scraped across the floor by itself. Then, from the darkness, Elias stepped forward. His pale face was expressionless, his dark eyes hollow. "You have to forget," he murmured. His voice echoed, as if coming from far away. "You have to forget, or you'll end up like me." Olivia took a step back. What happened to you?" Elias tilted his head. "I never transferred." And suddenly, she understood. Elias had always been at St. Helena High. Trapped. Forgotten. A ghost bound to the school, unable to move on because no one remembered his story. I don't want to forget, Olivia whispered. The shadows around Elias seemed to pulse, as if the darkness itself was alive. Then you'll be next, he said softly. The lights went out. A deafening silence filled the room. And Olivia was never seen again. The next day, when the students arrived, no one noticed an empty desk where Olivia once sat. No one spoke her name. No one remembered. Just as no one remembered Elias Carter. Answer, the silent student remained. Waiting for the next one to notice.